Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the War Report. Now, believe it or not, and I mentioned this as we were recording last episode, Biden gave his first joint address to Congress, which again technically is not State of the Union because he hasn't been in office the past year, only since January. But again, he addressed Congress to a very minimum crowd because of the current COVID restrictions, all that kind of stuff. And it was, all I can say is completely unremarkable. Whereas if we compare it to Trump, which maybe isn't fair, Trump was always memorable, whether it was really good or really bad or somewhere in between, because his 2020 speech, State of the Union, wasn't the greatest, also wasn't horrible, but it generally laid out what he wanted to do. 2019 was terrible. You can go back and watch that episode. That's when he announced the campaign of international homosexualization decriminalization and we need even more immigrants. That kind of rhetoric, 2019 Trump. But regardless of whatever Trump would do, is he would do something to advance the narrative in either direction, in any direction really, because he would either smash the narrative or he would play into it. And he always presented some path forward, even if you didn't necessarily like it, which a lot of times I'll admit I did not like it myself. Biden, it just seemed like listening to his State of the Union, listening to his address to Congress, felt like you were living in a void. Like very abstract ideas, very vague platitudes. And again, that's par for the course for politics, but they didn't fit into any broader narrative, any broader story, any broader idea. It just seemed like really just empty talking points. And even as much as I would have disliked somebody like Bush and Obama, going back, like they have narratives. Bush saying things like "You're either with us or you're with the terrorists." Obama's claptrap about hope and change. Like those are narratives. You can dislike them, but those are narratives no less. Biden, it's like completely vacuum. He talked some things about economic recovery, manufacturing, all the usual stuff. He talked about confronting climate change, but there was really nothing big. There was no big hook. There was nothing that really drew you in, or did you get an idea of how Biden even plays into the system? And I think it was very fitting of his presidency so far. He's only been in office just over 100 days or so, just over 3 months. But it's as if we have an absentee president. I've used that term before. And I think that speech really encapsulated what the Biden administration represents. Just a just a ship kind of on drone pilot and just going on the course that was previously charted before it got temporarily taken over by some rogue. And yeah, like it's, or maybe that's even too generous of an interpretation, just a ship sitting in port really. And there was no substance to it, there was no elements to it, and like I said, there wasn't even things for me to dislike or get angry at. That's how bad it was.
I mean, I have my big takeaways were, I mean, the only vague message was his, without overtly stating it, was build back better. I don't recall whether he actually used those exact words, but it was certainly implicit. Um, you know, talk of infrastructure, raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour, which, I mean, I'd love to see it only as an accelerationist because that would just create inflation through the roof. And
I'd
but
hate to see
America's
because
been
it
this,
directly affects my bottom line, but that's beside the point.
right, because what you have in America is you have economic growth plus inflation, and those are two divergent paths. They actually, to be honest, oppose each other. And the way that America's maintained that is cheap labor, right? Hence one of the reasons why they need a constant flow of migrants with low expectations is because that keeps wages down and that keeps inflation down. There's been economists who have mentioned that. Even forget his name, but he was in charge of the Federal Reserve quite a few years ago. So um, it is a thing, and that's quite a gamble. That's quite a gamble to do that. Um, you know, it wasn't. I agree with you. It wasn't anything we haven't already heard. Um, we've already had the Biden leaks that have been. I mean, they're not leaks, but he he's going over old territory that has been mentioned in one short press conference after another, either by him or by someone in his administration. So yeah, pretty, overall not remarkable. I will say the stream that I watched, um, there were a lot of Dems and Libs that were applauding it, that thought it was amazing, and in a way, that's all they need. That's all he needs. Um, but yeah, nothing, very remarkable.
I will say one big PR victory for Biden that came out of it is the fact that despite what he was saying didn't really have any substance, he was very coherent throughout the whole thing.
Yes, yes. He was coherent. It was unusual because he'll have these press conferences. I don't, they're much shorter. This was over an hour, just slightly over an hour, and he has gaffes where he's been interviewed for no longer than 5 minutes. So it was extraordinary that he made it for at least an hour or more without any gaffes.
It really makes you wonder, like, because we all know it's an open secret that the president gets a cocktail of medications from Secret Service,
Yeah,
CIA, whatever. It makes you wonder what's in Biden's cocktail of medications, and it by proxy it makes you wonder what did all these other presidents have to take? Like, do they? Because I imagine they have to have a regimen for every specific one because, of course, they're different people. I would think, and again, I'm no doctor, but they probably had him on Adderall or something.
yeah, and whatever senility drugs he's been on for probably quite some time at this point. Um, but those drugs have diminishing returns, and they actually speed up the process of senility. So,
Which is why they only break him out for the big stuff like this.
right, and eventually, I don't think he's going to be very coherent at the close of his first term. So, and we don't
At the
know what's
close of
going to
Kamala's
happen.
first term.
Yeah.
Let's just be clear about that because I'm curious to see what his 2022 State of the Union will look like, or any other big speeches or events he'll have. Now, again, he's not a showman like Trump was, where Trump would just have a rally to have a rally, whether that be on 4th of July or any time else. So, again, that's no surprise. Biden's always been a bit more reclusive, even in his more coherent days. It's just his temperament's just the kind of politician he is. But it will be surprising. It will be interesting to see, I will say, when he is put in these situations like these public holidays, wherever, where he has to give some sort of statement or address that maybe is a little bit lengthier, and how he comes out of those. Like I said, I think we have a good chance of the 2022 State of the Union being a bit of a garbled mess. To be honest, if you would have asked me like before the election, it's actually been 6 months since election day is the time we're recording this. I would have said there's no way he could even get through a State of the Union, but like they must be pumping him full of some really super strong anti-senility drugs, and we'll see how often they break those out and what the diminishing returns on those are and what the side effects are. Because again, once it's one of those things that just goes more exponentially downhill as time goes on. So while he may have gaffes here and there, but can still relatively hold it together, we'll really have to see what happens when he gets a year on into his first term and how rapidly he would have declined since then. Or I I go back to the debate when it just comes to Biden in general. Okay, Now, physical health, he's not an unhealthy man, to what I understand, at least with what they tell us about his health records. And just looking at him, he doesn't look unhealthy. Whereas, again, everyone's big concern about him is what is his mental state? How good are his faculties? And I'm really curious whether they're going to ride it out, prop him up, keep him out of the public spotlight as much as possible, or are they going to wait until the moment where it's convenient and say he has to be removed on mental health grounds, he's not fit to lead this country, and put Kamala in office? And I do think that depends on, of course, the 2022 midterms and how that plays out, because that's really when things get serious for the term of a president, is after those midterm congressional elections. And I don't know, I could see Republicans being rash enough to trying to remove him from office, not seeing that they might be putting potentially something worse into there. Or I could even see a carefully orchestrated effort by a Democratic controlled Congress to say, you know what, it's time for Joe to go into retirement. Of course, we love him, he's been great, but he's no longer what he used to be, and it's time for him to step down. Or maybe it won't even be like an impeachment or a congressional process, but it'll just be public pressure for him to go into retirement. We could see that, and again, I'm still pretty convinced whether it is through Biden having some sort of health instance and coming to that, as what comes with age, being almost 80 years old, or just a sharp mental decline, that he will not make it all the way through his first term. He will either be removed from office, step down, or die in office, and that we will have President Kamala Harris at some point over the next three and a half years. I really don't see any way how it doesn't end up that way. I think a lot of people would agree with me, but I think there'd be those few outliers saying like, "Oh yeah, he's gonna make it. He'll be a complete vegetable, but he'll make it."
Yeah, it is a wonder. I think the basic pattern is that for small press engagements, short press engagements, lower the cocktails. The only big cocktails for long addresses when you need them. So they're playing it
That and any diplomatic function they can't send Kamala to.
right. So they're being very judicious about this and very shrewd. But the dress itself, it had talking points that we've already heard. China, Russia, bad. Uh, we don't want any problems, but they're a problem. America is back. I mean, we've heard this for
Yeah,
a year.
reiterate the commitment to the Iran deal and negotiations with Iran, that kind of stuff. But
Yeah.
speaking of foreign negotiations, North Korea has dispelled any notion of a second, or at this point, a third meeting with an American delegation, led specifically by the American president. And Kim Jong Un, I can't remember exact words, but it was very strong and very sharp criticism of Biden, saying, "We want nothing to do with it. Pretty much, we want nothing to do with this dog. We want nothing to do with this vile man, and we have no interest in negotiations from this point forward." Which was sort of implied, I think, in 2019 after the Hanoi summit fell apart. But
Mhm.
there was still some diplomatic overtures, and really, I think things fell apart is when South Korean and North Korean delegations stopped meeting on the regular, and that happened sometime in April, May of 2019. Which again, that was always the most important, the inter-Korean dialogue, as opposed to what the outside world had to say. Now, of course, the Korean Peninsula, throughout its history, and particularly its recent history, has been the battleground of great powers, whether that be Russia, China, Japan, the U.S., etc. But again, in terms of unity of the Korean Peninsula, it came down to the North and South, and it looks like they're both satisfied with the status quo. Now, the demilitarizations that have taken place, it doesn't seem like they've built back up the stuff that they dismantled on the border, but of course the border is still one of the most heavily militarized places in the world. I think currently still the most heavily militarized border in the world, which again isn't much surprise. Now, they might have their contenders in upcoming conflicts and current conflicts, but still, at that point, any inter Korean dialogue was probably off the table again, like after mid 2019. And any U.S. Korean dialogue was off the table by early 2019. And I'm not saying, like, of course, I'm not a fan of Biden, but I'm not saying this is like, oh, Biden ruined Trump's progress. No, that ship sailed. It was over before it even started. But with all that being said, I do think it still shows, whether it be Trump or no matter who's in office, but the United States as a global power has declined in prestige enough where, regardless of who holds the office, it doesn't hold that sort of sway anymore, and that when it comes to these sort of regional conflicts and these conflicts that have been going on for a while, and we've pointed this out, especially with a lot of Middle Eastern things, somewhat with Ukraine, their opinion and role is going to be less and less relevant in these theaters.
Yeah, I mean, you can kind of see the America's unipolar moment falling apart roughly around 2005. The Iraq War and the Afghan War are not going as they had started, which were very positive and very quickly dispelled their enemies, and America took over. But by 2005, resurgence were there, and they were, there to stay. Uh, During the Obama years, it was already known that America was not going to be able to bring a liberal democracy to these places, and so the attention shifted toward Libya and Syria. But I would say it was already over by then. And it's a very gradual thing. America, world trade used the American dollar in the 70 some odd percent, and now it's in the 60s. So you see this kind of decline, roughly 10 percentage points by decade. That may accelerate, but I would say when the American dollar is used for less than 50% of transactions around the world, and that's increasing, uh, then I think you're going to see a lot of problems arise. Um, and it's also best to look at, really from a neutral point of view, that Trump himself was, um, he's a symptom of this system. He didn't ruin it. I mean, he would never have gotten elected if there was good governance to begin with. But there wasn't, and they are absolutely headstrong in the direction that we heard in Biden's address, and in the days following, where we're talking about how they propose to deal with Russia or China, or how they particularly are going to deal with, would-be white terrorists, and of course, Biden made that speech. I'm sorry, made that statement in his speech, in his address, about white terrorism. White terrorism is the greatest threat in America. Um, of course, they're going to have a very loosey-goosey definition of what that is, primarily because this white America is being prepped for becoming a minority very, very soon, and any resistance to that is, you're a potential terrorist. Um, but yeah, North Korea has shunned the delegation. Part of the reason for that is because, well, the Biden administration is, you know, less conciliatory. It doesn't want, probably, to actually work out a deal. It's in the process. It's bifurcated with two important tasks. One, to diminish and make the Trump presidency a historical irrelevancy, which it cannot, but it is fixated on that. And to do that, it must message far more severely than in Obama's administration what it is that let's say, to use a Mulbuggian term, what it is that the American blue empire wants. And North Korea, I'm very sure, was watching the Alaska summit and said, no way. You spoke that way to the Chinese. We're not having it, which will only make the Chinese and the Russians all that more happy. Kim Jong Un has time on his side, and that's the prevailing idea, I would say, amongst countries and their leaders such as Iran, Russia, China, North Korea. They see time is on their side. For that dynamic to change, America will have to act, and it will have to act either militarily or it must convince all its old allies to side with them. And the bargain that they're going to have to deliver is this the pitch that they're going to have to make is this: you side with us, and you will be less prosperous, though they'll never say that, but you will be more secure because you're not going to want a world run by China. You're going to want us to continue to run it. Um, so let's say that this is by far the most likely scenario instead of a scenario that involves a military conflict, right? Because although China is asserting itself, it knows that it's on a trajectory where it will overtake America in the next decade, definitely by 2025, 2026. So we're about 5 years out from that. Uh, so it doesn't need to rush it. I think part of what China is doing is demonstrating to America its powerlessness in many ways. People are scoffing at America, whether it's 60 Minutes or whether it's Jeff Todd or any of these characters, let's say the Meet the Press. Um, though even Hillary Clinton this week on two occasions came out and said, well, President Biden has had to make a very difficult choice, but there are going to be severe consequences. And you know, her and Condoleezza Rice, by the way, uh, both spoke out against Biden leaving Afghanistan, right? So I think the game that China is
as well as
playing,
Anthony Blinken.
yes, yes. So I think that the game that China is playing is the game that the American deep state, the fortified election people, um, what's his name, the guy that was on Obama's team, Podesta, all those characters that work together with the Pentagon and work together with retired generals and CNN in order to fortify the election and work closely with BLM activists. This whole nonsense, this whole color revolution rigging, um, that is a sign of weakness. Most world leaders have not seen anything so explicit. It doesn't matter really anymore, given the kind of limelight America receives, to just waste time arguing about. But what do Americans think? The fact is everything America does is for the world's public. So that's a sign of weakness, and China is going to keep pushing the limit to see whether America will react or not, whether it's going to fall back on its rhetoric for more sanctions. Very similar to the way that Trump couldn't and wouldn't do anything about Twitter. Very similar to the way Trump looked powerless to all the BLM riots, right? Um, and it's an interesting thing, to hear Condoleezza Rice talk about the consequences of pulling out of Afghanistan because, you know, her papers that she wrote in the mid 90s, not unlike Buchanan and other thinkers at that time after the fall of the Soviet Union, was now we have to do something about China while we still can. And we'll need Russia in order to solve that problem. Of course, that all changed, and it changed particularly. Well, I mean, it wasn't really possible under Clinton, but there were a lot of people who were theorizing what would have to be done. And that can just got kicked down the road. administration after administration and administration, and now they're having to fall back on papers that were written literally 25 years ago, a quarter of a century, to deal with this. So I think North Korea senses the weakness, and again, I make another parallel. I would say, based on those exit polls, that 5% of white males. Now, this, who knows? It's speculation. To show that Trump's popularity increased with every single demographic based on race and gender and ethnicity, except for white men, where it decreased, is, quite frankly, incredible. The only thing I can say is the reason for that is just the powerlessness that was demonstrable all throughout 2020. It wasn't
Yes,
just the COVID.
apathy, and it's not that these people defected to Biden, it's that they checked out politically. They didn't vote, or
Yeah,
they voted for some third party as a protest vote. It's just that these people thought, Trump, he's gonna make America great again. He's gonna fix these problems that Obama and Hillary and the Democrats put on us, and that the Rhino Republicans put on us. Well, it turns out he was a massive disappointment. And I think there were instances from 2017 to 2019 where that was evident, but I think 2020 made it undeniable to these people.
yeah, yeah. So, I would say that, yeah, that's a very strong explanation. The fact is revolutions tend to happen because the perception of the leaders is that they're weak, or weak and decadent, or that their life force is spent. Uh, I mean, I think 2020 made that clear. Um, it made it clear that Trump was not in charge, and another 4 years were pointless. I think for people less astute, the perception was that Trump had come around. Like, coming around means like the cities get overrun and billions of dollars worth of damage, 36 deaths from these riots, including police. Not one protester was killed, however, but police were, and no one was charged. So I think people sense the chaos. Um, so it's not lost on North Korea, that the chaos that is enveloping the U.S. And those 4 years with Trump really did make a difference. It didn't matter whether you were I would say, a liberal in the Western world or elsewhere on the globe, and were dissatisfied and even angry at Trump's electoral victory, or whether you were indifferent. Um, the, you know, I think it made it clear that America couldn't really throw its weight around the way it used to, and that for all the talk about China being a paper tiger, paper tiger, paper tiger, it's still climbing. Uh, it's still a partner, particularly in Africa, that countries would rather deal with China than with America. And again, it's the tone, which is what the tone would have been if there was a meeting with Kim Jong Un. It would have been, your civil rights are abysmal, your women's rights are abysmal, your gay and trans rights are abysmal. How dare you? It's literally Greta Thunberg, and talking about other issues. That's what American foreign policy has come to. I mean, part of it is hubris, and part of it is really a lack of creativity. Now, America has enjoyed being the world's leading theopolitical country, and everyone needs to, in some way or another, agree with some of the foundational myths of America.
Yeah, there's a reason why countries like Syria and Belarus still LARP as democratic republics.
Yeah, yeah. So it's still pervasive, right? Um, but they have their own internal forces that resist and can resist a certain amount of pressure that arises out of America toward them. So anyhow, that's my long-winded answer for the summit.
Well, with all
Uh,
that being said, I
app.
we have some interesting forecasts out of Europe, and not only weather forecasts. Now, I don't know about the weather patterns of Europe currently. I know they had those bad snowstorms back when the United States was having them, and that polar vortex thing. That thing was a doozy. But moving on to what is actually relevant is some European economic forecasts, and you'll see right here is the blue line on the graph. For those of you who can see the screen, is the real GDP from 2007 and the real gross GDP for the European Union and in this graph you'll see that while GDP on paper, real gross domestic product, is rising, you'll see that the European Union is on decline. Now, I probably didn't do the best job explaining this graph. I'm not an economist, but point being is big line going down is what I can tell you with my vast economic expertise. And this just isn't because of the coronavirus. This is again a phenomenon mainly in southern Europe. You think Spain, Italy, Greece, the pigs countries, Portugal, that have not had a stable economy since the '08 crisis, and even the economic powerhouses of Europe, such as France and Germany, are faltering and suffering right now. Unemployment isn't exploding, but it's slowly but surely crawling upwards. It's not that high yet, but again, Europe is in an economic crisis, and I do think that, and I said this at the beginning, coronavirus might not be the big world ending, civilizational collapsing pandemic, but I think it's going to put pressure on a lot of previous problems. And would that be the disease itself and its effects, or the response to the disease itself? Now, I think about a year and a couple months out from the initial outbreak of the crisis, it's more so the response that has led to these problems. But again, Europe's economic resources, economic growth, has been stifled, it's been faltered, and this has been a worldwide phenomenon, of course. We see this in the United States, even though the American economy in the first quarter is slowly but surely chugging along as things gradually start to reopen, because Biden's great reopening plans, what they'll tell you all about, and the mass drive for vaccinations, and thank you, President Biden, for fixing our economy and fixing us on the world stage. But again, with all that being said, I don't think this is too much of a surprise, and I'm really curious what this will lead to, because last time there were these sort of economic problems, or these sort of potential economic problems in Europe, we got the Yellow Vest protests that were mainly in France, but of course spread out to other countries such as Belgium, even Germany had some demonstrations. The UK tried to have demonstrations that failed horribly. Nobody should be surprised by that. I think even Spain did. I know at the time of the Yellow Vests, the Italian government still had Salvini in it, and he was a big voice of support. So, again, I do think you have the potential to see pretty big social and political upheaval come out of any economic downturn, especially when things are as volatile as they are. A lot of people are already saying, well, the economy's been the most unstable it's been, the world economy's been the most unstable it's been since 1929, which I usually write off as doomsday sort of stuff, but as time goes on, I'm less inclined to do that. I'm starting to think that you might not be right, but I also don't think you're entirely wrong. And out of all the dominoes economically to fall in Europe first, I'm going to take a very obvious, very straightforward answer and say Italy, again, is always in a state of economic and political crisis pretty much since the end of the Second World War, and even a little bit before. They're still the fourth largest economy in Europe, and if crisis were to rock them, that would still have massive implications. In fact, I think they're actually the third largest now that Brexit has officially happened. And of
Hmm.
course, you have France and Germany. I think France is more likely to have an economic crisis before Germany is, but with how interconnected the European Union is, one suffers, they all suffer. So, uh, like I said, Italy, despite the fact that it's traditionally viewed as a weaker economy, a less stable economy, still third largest in the European Union currently, and that could set off what could only be described as a chain reaction. And again, I think Europe is due for pretty big social, political, and economic upheaval in the next few years. I think Nord Stream 2 becoming a thing is a sign of that. And I think the narrative that we will build is this is a crisis, if not fomented by Russia outright, one that they're going to exploit and take advantage of. Now, that is true. There is room for the Russians to expand their influence in Europe in a time of economic, social, and political crisis. There's also room for the United States and China to do the exact same thing. So, Europe could become a ground of competition there, which I do think, and going back to the Macron analysis we like to do on the show, that's why you have somebody like Macron so adamant about turning Europe into a cohesive bloc, not only in economic sense, but in a geopolitical sense at least. I don't know where Macron stands on European federalism. I'm actually not sure, but
I don't think he knows all the time,
um,
to be honest.
yeah, that's probably the case. But point being is, if not like an internally like federalized force, like on the world stage acting as a unified coalition, a unified block, or a single unit, if you will. And I think that people like Macron, love them or hate them, they have the foresight to see that Europe is on the brink of a major crisis and that they will be left to be picked apart by outside powers and subjected to another century of foreign domination as they were during the Cold War if they don't get their act together in some way. And I think that sort of mindset, whether you be a European neoliberal, a European populist, socialist, whatever, is going to become more and more common, especially among Western Europeans, people from places like Germany, France, even into the Scandinavian countries, Italy, Spain, etc. I do think you'll get this idea of maybe you're a Eurosceptic, maybe you don't like the European Union as an organization, but some sort of European unity as in a coalition of nations that are at least temporarily working together to ward off outside influences, or maybe take advantage of set outside influences. And I think, again, Nord
Hmm.
Stream's another example of that. But I would say, really, it's going to be at. I think new quote unquote battle lines are being drawn in Europe. I think the borders of a new Cold War are being battled in Europe. Whether and how those will play out, will it be a geographical thing, will it be an ideological thing, will it be a little of both? I think time will tell. But I do think you have a significant amount of people on the continent, a significant amount of political force on the continent that are ready for a complete reconciliation with Russia and ready to start dealing with them as a partner as much as they do with places like the United States and China, or or deal with China more as a partner. And do I? I think I still have the the map. Yep, I do still have the map, and of course, these were the projections by the one I can't. It was some geopolitical forecasting institutions, but point being is the pink countries, the purplish pink countries, wanted to pursue a more independent course. The dark blue wanted to solidify relations with the United States. The light blue wanted to maintain current relationships with the United States, and that's what the projections were for under Biden from this particular geopolitical forecast. The ones from Trump right here, I'll pull up. You'll see that a lot more was in pink with Trump. Not only do you have France and Germany, you also have Belgium, Austria, Croatia, Sweden. But point being is, I think even under Biden, I think a lot of these countries that are either dark blue or light blue would be pink if they did this analysis now or maybe 6 months from now. Because I think you had a lot of celebrations among more ignorant Europeans, more ignorant liberal Europeans who thought if only a Democrat gets back in the White House, if only we get another serious American president, we can get things back on track and we can do things like we were doing in the 90s and 2000s. And I think very shortly after Biden assumed office and the Democrats started to gain more political control of the federal government, a lot of these people quickly realized, even on the more liberal side, that this isn't happening, the United States, regardless of who's in power, is going to keep on functioning like this clown show. It's going to be a less dependable, less serious player on the world stage. And it's time to take our destiny into our own hands.
Yeah, I mean, I remember when we first showed this graph, it was interesting then, and it is now. Um, in a way, it shows the demarcation between the two different types of Eurosceptics in Europe, and they're basically the ones. The way they're divided is the less independent states want America to be there to continue their work, and the big players, the real economies of Europe, like Germany and to a lesser extent France, would like to go on a more independent path. Um, and part of the reason is that we've brought up Nord Stream 2, and critics of Nord Stream 2 have rightly stated that um, Germany's already at peak oil and peak gas. It doesn't need any more. The only reason they're doing this is for transit fees. Well, yeah, of course, for transit fees. The way Germany is looking at this is a greater supply of gas and oil will help them lower their emissions based on coal. As I mentioned last time, Germany is actually the largest user of coal in Europe, which is it's very surprising. I mean, I was quite surprised when I read that. But then Eastern Europe, since the fall of the Soviet Union, has been deindustrialized. So, yeah, I mean, the reason why you have skeptics in Western Europe different than those in Eastern Europe is because the ones in Western Europe see themselves as more powerful, competent countries with a history of greater autonomy and so on and so on. And they feel that they still have that if, however, if they band together. And why America has kind of chosen to tread this line with, it was particularly evident with Trump, um, Poland and Hungary were not really criticized by his administration, though Biden called them basically like near the dictatorships because they lacked a certain amount of wokeism. So yeah, I do find that interesting.
Which is sort of funny in the ironic sense, not that hypocrisy means anything to these people. I think Hungary is one of the few European parliamentary democracies where a single party actually commands a majority of the constituency. Because Fidesz has something like 51, 52% of the seats in the Hungarian parliament, whereas you have these Frankenstein coalitions in countries like Germany, countries like Italy, the UK, etc., where you'll have four or five different parties of vaguely the same ideological band together to form a governing coalition. And, Italy is really bad about that in particular, but the fact that Hungary can command a certain amount of the electorate to vote for one party is where the issue arises, which I think is quite funny. Again, not that I'm a big supporter of democracy or anything, I'm not, but just the way these definitions get twisted and how they used to have a degree of subtlety, a degree of masking
Hmm.
with this, pardon the pun,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
now it's completely. Democracy is when you have LGBTQIA rights, women in the workforce, and do things that we like. Dictatorship is when you may have the will of the people behind you, but you banned transgender story hour.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, who knows? Much of it could be like in preparation for what's often called the Fourth Industrial Revolution. So, you know, uh, everybody, I think, to a certain extent, is aware of how the Industrial Revolution from the 19th century onwards changed dynamics, particularly between men and women, and how that created thousands of new jobs that women were willing to do because prior to that, there were frankly a lot more dangerous jobs only. I mean, that took a long period, and then women were brought into the workforce, and
Of course, the
that
world wars where they had to make up the deficits in employments in the factories because of the mass
right.
conscription of men, etc.
Yeah, good point. Um, so the fourth political theory is basically the notion that, especially after COVID, that a lot of this work can be done from home, and that creates a lot of autonomy. And with 3D printing and a bit of coaxing, maybe the right people who can fund more independent avenues. I think what elites are afraid of is you're going to bring back conditions that are not that both parents need to work in order to sustain a household, let alone one or two or 1.8 children. Uh, but what if it gets easier? What if the conditions are such that uh, people will want to have a lot more babies? So this becomes a huge problem. This is why you have guys like Schwab who are adamant about keeping the population down, and of course, climate change is a big part of this, right? So I think part of the wokeism is about that because it celebrates sterility for all its licentiousness, for all its apparent eroticism. It is essentially sterile, and that's the reason it's pushed. That's one of the reasons. It's not the only one. It's more complex, of course. I don't want to be reductionist about it, but it is there.
Now, with that being said, a couple of short stories I want to do before we get on to the big news of the Middle East and Central Asia is it looks like countries like Turkey and Egypt and even Algeria are leaning more towards the Russian arms market than the American arms market. I do think this is just showing a general shift again in geopolitical power, but also ingenuity, creativity, and the will to invent things. And this, I would say, probably translates beyond the arms industry. You look at some of these Russian tech companies that are starting to be alternatives to Google, Yandex, and their various offshoots like Telemost, etc. We'll have to bring File Ranking on to talk more about that stuff. But I do think it's also a pretty stark contrast, and you see China also entering a lot of these markets too, whether that be maybe not so much arms, a lot of Chinese military equipment and tanks, fighter planes, etc., are still pretty much copies of what the Russians make, licensed out to them. But again, that's beside the point. But I do think one of the other shifts you're seeing in global power is the rise in innovation, whereas innovation seems to really be stagnating in the U.S. and the Western world, and that you just need to look at the libertarians who occasionally have good points, especially when it comes to wasteful spending, about the sort of scientific endeavors that the U.S. government funds, that Congress passes in these bills when it comes to studying things like sexuality in giraffes, or just again these various things, or various hormonal treatments for the LGBTQIA, or uh, a lot of use. Not that all social science is useless, but like a lot of the really particularly useless social sciences stuff. Whereas you have, especially arms innovation coming out of places like Russia, and technological innovation, and again, China has been big in the smartphone era in terms of manufacturing. I mean, Apple makes their smartphones out of China. You know for a fact that the Chinese government, these Chinese corporations, have scalped the technology and corporate secrets of these companies that they manufacture things for. I mean, they outright admitted it. The theft of intellectual property, etc. Places like Korea as well have also done similar things. But I do think we're entering an interesting era where uh, I think it shows really where things are civilizationally, whether that be in arms, whether it be in any other kind of technology, or just innovation as a whole. Seemingly, a lot more is coming out of the east, out of Russia and China, than out of the west. You would think traditional strongholds of that, such as the U.S., even Germany, UK, etc. And I think that will be an interesting thing going forward. Perhaps you'll see these languages, a shift in the language barrier now. Of course, for a lot of the world population, Mandarin is a much less known and much harder language to learn than English or French or a lot of other European languages, and it helps the Europeans have about a 400-year head start in terms of global colonization when it comes to language. But again, I mean, you might think that Russian might be more doable for some of these people. The Russian language still has a lot of power, but again, you'll see how that turns out. And I do think one thing you'll have to watch for, especially when it comes to shifting global power, is where do language barriers pick up? And you've seen, funny enough, the French language actually increase in influence in places like Africa and not so much East Asia, but like a lot of Africa, even countries that were not French colonies, that were Spanish and English colonies, starting to adopt more French language programs, etc. Whereas English programs, they still dominate. They're still, I mean, you have these what I like to call cultural commissars of Americans who go abroad to teach English. Again, they're the new agents of imperialism. The people who go abroad to teach English, and I don't know. Maybe it's just because of the way the Chinese conduct business, they're more willing to acquiesce to your language and send translators because I don't know. They honestly might just be more protective of their language because they're more ethnocentric. But again,
Yeah.
uh,
Hmm.
I think one big thing to watch for is the shift in the lingua franca of the world or of particular regions and places when it comes to the battle of innovation between the great powers.
This is a very good metric to pick up on because I think, particularly with Bilkin, Blunkin going around, and then a recent uh, law that could be passed in Brussels to make English the second official language, the third official language after Dutch and French, or there are particular variants in Belgium of French and Dutch. Um, but it's an important metric nonetheless because for the longest time French was a diplomatic language spoken by parties who were neither French. Of course, an example is Tsarist Russia, but there were many other examples as well. Uh, Even in my mother's time,
Yeah,
French was
a lot of
still,
like modern diplomacy terms have their roots in French.
that's right. So it was this, you know, language with this amazing clout that was far beyond just France or France dealing with other Europeans. It transcended that, and so to see it rise, in Africa particularly is interesting. Also, there was a few weeks ago, Macron was he in Chad? That guy, Idris Deby, was the president was killed. Uh, he went to the front lines and was like shot there, and his son has been made like temporary president for now. And Macron went to visit. So Macron is going out of his way to create good relations with the Africans, particularly because of the relations that Africa has been developing with China for some time now. So if there's one European country that can woo Africa, it's probably going to be France.
Yeah, and I've been saying for a few years now the big proxy battles in Africa, and to agree with Brzezinski because despite a lot of my issues with Brzezinski's policy prescriptions, I still think he had a very solid, coherent view of how the world works and how the current dynamics of the world are for his time and even up until he died in 2017, 2018. But America will not follow China into Africa. That's one thing he hammered on in the last years of his life. But I think France, they are, and I think they will continue to follow China into Africa, if not outmaneuver them there. And I think the big battle for Africa is going to be between the French and the Chinese.
Right. And, let's not forget, he said some really way out there things just even a year or two before he died. Uh, I don't know quite how he meant it or how exactly he envisioned it, but one of the most startling things that I remember him saying was, besides what you just mentioned, that under no terms should America bog itself down in Africa. That would be particularly in America's case. That would be. potentially politically suicidal given its large black population. There are other reasons, even if that weren't the case. But also, America has just frankly less of a historical footprint there, except for North Africa. But some of the crazy things that he said that are, I guess, turning out to some degree was that Russia and China would be more responsible for stability in the Middle East. That's not something I think people were thinking that Brzezinski was going to say in 2016. And but I think even more fascinating and interesting is the reasons why. And this was at an Atlantic Council meeting. It was either Atlantic Council or CSIS, and he said, "Well, we live in a world right now where 50, 100 years ago, these places where Westerners had colonial power, even in the post-colonial world, much of the population, you know, frankly, didn't even know about the Crusades. And with racial and ethnic politics being what they are, particularly, you know, I'm going to say this, but part of it is because of America's own leadership and its own internal problems and contradictions. But that became kind of a bedrock for, let's say, woke learning in the Middle East, even though it's only a segment that they took. And now there is a great resentment towards them. And it's no longer a resentment based on the 20th century, but it goes back now 1,000 years, to the Crusades. And so that was an interesting analysis by him. He felt that the West simply could no longer maintain it. It no longer had legitimacy in the Middle East.
And I think that was one of his predictions that ended up being proven right. Now, I'm sure he's not happy about that, but he was right. And
Yeah. I mean, he's ever the realist, right? He's more or less a realist. He's only maybe a fraction bit more ideological and ruthless than, I mean, not that Mearsheimer is. They're both realists, but Mearsheimer is not, um, uh, directing policies and analyzing for the Pentagon.
well, I
That's
swear that Brzezinski's realist view of the world, his ability to look at these situations as much as he disliked them, came from the classic Slavic pessimism.
very likely.
But with that being said, I'll move into the news about Central Asia before closing out the Middle East. So, Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, two former Soviet republics, are embroiled in a small border conflict now that could, again, boil over. We'll see how that works. But it's based mainly on ethnic conflict. Now, for context, the Kyrgyz are a Turkic people similar to the other peoples of Central Asia, such as Kazakhs, such as Turkmens, etc. Whereas the Tajiks, they are Persians with the caveat that they are mostly Sunni Muslims instead of Shia. That's really the biggest difference between a Tajik and a Persian. It's the same language, it's mostly the same culture. It's just that one's wedged further up in the mountains and practices a different sect of Islam. Now, upon the drawing of the borders within the Soviet Union, this would have been early Soviet Union, 30s, 40s, even back into the 20s. They just drew these Central Asian country borders based on slim ethnic majorities. If a village was 51% Kyrgyz and 49% Tajik or whatever, then the village went to Kyrgyzstan or the Kyrgyz Soviet Socialist Republic. And these borders stayed mostly the same after the fall of the USSR. The main conflict upon the fall of the Soviet Union was in the Caucasus. It was between, again, mainly Armenia and Azerbaijan, but even the Ossetians and the Georgians and the Abkhazians, that was still a pretty significant conflict. Of course, not much compared to the Azeris and Armenians, but you didn't see too much conflict coming out of Central Asia upon the collapse of the Soviet Union. Now, you did see a massive Russian repatriation to Russia proper from those places, but a lot of Central Asia stayed relatively calm and stable. And you'll recall in Kyrgyzstan there was a what was possibly a color revolution, but mass protests against the president of Kyrgyzstan, forcing his resignation, putting an interim leader in there, and scheduling elections. I don't know whether those elections have taken place or not, but it looks like that general political instability led to something of a conflict on the border. And we'll see how this plays out. Tensions have been higher there, but they've never boiled over like this. And again, this could be the next big thing, and I believe they are both participants in the One Belt, One Road initiative, so you could see outside hands playing a role in that, or maybe China playing a role in that, trying to mediate that conflict or taking one side or the other in order to further their goals in Central Asia in terms of building this new Silk Road that they want to build. But I do think that although it remains a minor conflict for now, it's Central Asia and going back to Brzezinski, if the Americans, if the Atlanticists in particular want to rule the world, they not necessarily have to control Central Asia, but they have to have some sort of wedge in Central Asia, whether that be troops in Afghanistan, etc. And you saw a big courting of the Central Asian countries by the United States after the fall of the Soviet Union, and going even this day. Kazakhstan has at least up until recently, I believe they had a pretty decent diplomatic relationship with the United States. Now, of course, they're close to Russia; they're much more in the Russian orbit. But again, you'll see how this plays out, and especially with a Turkic versus Persian conflict, I will be interested to see how this affects things like pan-Turkic nationalism, whether Erdogan will cast his lots here, try to play a pan-ethnic defender, and how what implications it will have in the Uyghur region of China, where
Mm.
the those tensions are playing out. And it feels like we're in last century because pan-Turkism is seemingly becoming, I wouldn't necessarily say a relevant political force, but a relevant news topic at least.
Yeah, I mean this conflict, which is low intensity, but it is not resolved. Really seemed like it came out of nowhere, and you're absolutely right about how this could benefit, particularly America with Kyrgyzstan right on China's border, another Turkic Asiatic people, Central Asiatic people. Tajiks do have some Asiatic features in their physiognomy, but they look like a blend between that Mediterranean look that you find, Middle Eastern Mediterranean look that you find in Iran proper. But they have, you can tell that there is a certain amount of Asian there as well. I actually met a Tajik in Russia in 2018 and spent some time with them. That was very interesting. But yeah, you could see how this could be beneficial right away. Um, it's hard to say what's going to go, well, what's going to go down. I honestly thought that one of the hot spots that was going to happen. I mean, I was much, much younger. This is 20 years ago, and even more so than even more than 20 years ago was Uzbekistan. I thought would become, a hotbed because of, let's say, a seeping in of what's often called, Muslim extremism or Salafism, or whatever term you might want to use.
Pan Islamism, whatever, especially with
Yeah.
the fallout of the conflict in Afghanistan.
hmm Yeah, and I imagine the Russians are keeping a very close eye on this. Uh,
And
you
as
know,
if correct me if I'm wrong, but I still believe they have a military presence in both countries.
I think so. And also, I know in Tajikistan, Russian is the official language of diplomacy and international relations. Tajik is of course an official language, naturally, but uh, and that's spoken throughout every strata of Tajikistan. But let's say for the upper echelons, particularly in diplomacy and business, Russian is as well. It's the other official language in that regard.
Yeah, not only for how they deal with the outside world, but how the outside world deals with them. Because you look at where they are politically, maybe internally, they of course they don't resemble Russia. They do have a small Russian remnant population from both the imperial and Soviet colonization of the region, but again, they're mostly within the Russian sphere. Russia, more or less, I would say they're a client state of them, and Western influence hasn't seeped in the same way it's seeped into a lot of the former Soviet Union. Central Asia has been relatively shielded from that. Some may say geography, some may say culture, probably a bit of both. But
Mhm.
again, even it is funny because you have a lot more Russophone countries like Ukraine and even somewhere like Moldova that fall more and more under the Western sphere than this people that is fundamentally not only a different ethnic background but a different racial background as well, remaining much more closer to Russia.
Yeah, yeah,
But with
very much.
that being said, we can move on to our Middle Eastern news now. Starting out with Iraq, the Kurds and the Turks have been trading blows there. It looks like Turkey has not entirely taken its focus and attention off Syria, but definitely put it on the back burner compared to the Kurdish populations and Kurdish movements within Iraq, which have a lot more political legitimacy in Iraq under the occupation constitution that was written for them. I believe it was in '06 when they formed the new government of that was going to be this wonder coalition of Shias and Kurds while completely excluding the Sunnis, which of course led to the insurgency, Al Qaeda, ISIS in Iraq, etc. But it looks like Turkey is taking issue with the Kurdish population there, which it was a matter of time. Those things spill over the border. These various political factions between the PKK in Turkey proper, the YPG in Syria, the Peshmerga in Iraq, they're all pretty interconnected, even if ideologically in Syria and Turkey they're more left wing, more on the socialist communist side, whereas the Peshmerga is vaguely right wing, quote unquote. But again, it's no surprise that there is some sort of ethnic solidarity even across border. But you do see this playing out, and I am curious with the volatility in Iraq if maybe Turkey can make the U.S. this wonderful deal, since the U.S. main goal in Iraq, whether that be Trump, whether that be Biden, Republican, Democrat, etc., is curtailing Iranian influence. That is a problem that they let get way too far out of hand with the Iraq War, with the rise of ISIS and the withdrawal from Afghanistan. Is that Iran started running large parts of the country, and Shia Muslim militias and pro-Iranian militias started running large parts of the country. And of course, anti-American sentiment is up across the board. I would say, funny enough, the Kurds are probably the only ones with a pro-American sentiment in Iraq, and that's being a bit generous, assuming the Kurds don't feel spurned and betrayed. And to the point where, like, even the Sunni Muslims who may not like the Iranians, may not like the Shia Muslims, aren't necessarily pro-American. So I'm wondering if this is some sort of power play where Turkey can present itself as the protector and representative of Iraqi Sunni Muslims as opposed to the United States, and can use them as that political wedge in the country, whereas they're indirectly serving American interests, similar to the, I would say, days of 2012, 2013 Syria, where they played that role with the Syrian opposition, with all these various rebel factions, while allowing the United States to wash its hands of the situation and take a secondary role in it. Now, I can't say for sure, this conflict is too new to see where that's happening, but I wouldn't be surprised if the Turks, and again, with their ties with all of these Sunni Muslim militant groups in Syria throughout the years, I wouldn't have a hard time believing that they would do a similar thing in Iraq if they're not already doing a similar thing. And I would say, again, it's probably some sort of deal of convenience the U.S. accept from them or pitch them that Turkey, you can rabble rouse, you can raise hell in Iraq as long as you keep the Iranian and pro-Iranian forces on their toes and stay off our backs. We're willing to even sacrifice the Kurds to you. That's how far we're willing to go. And again, it shows that very complex dynamic with them, where it is in Syria. It seems like the U.S. foreign policy, even under Trump, was fully committed to, and of course, a lot of people say Trump betrayed the Kurds or whatever, but I would say, especially more so under Biden, that there can they are dedicated to the quote unquote Syrian democratic forces over Turkish influence in the country. Whereas it could be the case, and maybe that this will change like 5 years down the road or whatever, 2 years down the road, that they're willing to let Turkey raise some hell in Iraq for the time being, so long as it causes trouble for the Iranians, and we'll worry about the Kurds later.
Right, and that is an area. I mean, generally, Iran and Turkey have had historically really good relations, and
Including very
yet,
recently.
yeah, on Libya, much less so on Syria. But you can see that Turkey for America is has become itself like a mercenary force to do to do the jobs we refuse to do. Um, I mean, I'm being flippant. You know, Turkey does have vested interests there. Um, it's hard to imagine, Turkey being able to succeed in remaking that entire region because that is really the only conclusion if you look at Turkey's trajectory since it entered northern Syria. I mean, of course, America was going to go for it. It was going to be okay with it because, of course, that would be a problem for both Assad and Russia, particularly for Assad in being able to create a unity. Although, in a sense, it kind of backfired because, for one reason, a good deal of Kurds now side with Assad um, after Turkey's incursion. So, in a way, it's only brought them closer. Um,
Well, correction. I
I'm
would say a lot of SDF units side with Assad. Now, of course, the SDF is dominated by Kurds, but again, there's a lot of Arabs and a lot of other non-Kurdish and non-Arab minorities in there. You might think like the historical Assyrian populations or Yazidis or whatever, but
yeah.
the point stands that Turkey is viewed as the graver threat now, to the point where even a lot of Kurds are willing to begrudgingly cooperate with the Syrian government proper. I would say a large part of that is also due to the non-Kurdish ethnic groups in the SDF would be even more so willing to cooperate with the Syrian government, especially the self-identified Arabs.
Yeah, yeah, I would agree. Um, because honestly, what it looks like in the making is a Turkish annexation of that area, or a kind of buffer zone where leadership will definitely not be Kurdish, or it will have to be so subservient, so subdued. Like the deal will have to be so great that they'll always, Turkey will feel safe, that they'll be able to crack down on any insurgents that might weave their way through into Turkey proper. Not unlike the situation in Chechnya uh, with uh, with Russia. Um, but of course, these are independent, and they're not even. I mean, they're not even independent. They still belong to other countries. They're not even their own countries, if we're going to be honest. So yeah, it's hard to see like how is Turkey going to pull this off because America sure as hell didn't. How is Turkey going to do it? I have to believe that even the Americans realize that Turkey is not going to accomplish this, but that for the moment it is the lesser of two bad options.
Oh yes, and again, that's just what they're willing to accept. And I suppose, especially the Middle East, but in these geopolitical struggles as well, that's really what the options come down to in more cases than not. You have to choose which is going to be less painful for us. Not even necessarily that. Which are we going to be able to squeeze more juice out of for my group personally. And that's just how these sort of things work. Like, we may hate these people, we may hate their guts, they may hate us, but there's more opportunities if they get their way than if the other guys get their way. And again, that describes conflict in the Middle East, and that describes a lot of, I would say, pretty much every conflict for the last century at least, if not further.
Right. Um, yeah, I agree. Um, so I don't know what to say. I don't. I think it's like I said. I think it's very much up in the air.
Well,
Um,
with that being said, we can move on to,
well, we've said it before that yeah. Go ahead.
yeah. I just figure we can move on to Syria from now. A bit more action in northwestern Syria. The Russians have been using those cluster bombs, that those missiles that explode midair and then rain the shrapnel down on the target. They've been implementing those in these areas of northwestern Syria and the greater Idlib area, even among the border with the Turkish-backed forces. And you have the Turkish-backed forces engaging in combat, and engaging in these skirmishes with both pro-government forces and other rival factions, whether that be opposition groups that broke off from the pro-Turkish camp or whatever. Of course, shelling of Kurdish positions in the SDF occupied parts of northeastern Syria. Russian patrols actually towards the Turkish border, Russian pro government patrols. U.S. forces are still just patrolling those oil fields in the far reaches of northeastern Syria. A lot of activity along the Euphrates on the government controlled side with Russian and pro Assad forces in general. So Syria is picking up slowly but surely. There's no real big news out of Syria this week, but it looks like things are starting to return to what they were, I would say, about 6 months ago, funny enough, right before the election, and like during the fallout of the election, where action was ongoing because the world was focused on so many other things besides Syria, where uh, both sides could get away with these big offensives and these big maneuvers. And I think we're starting to see a return to that with the current state of geopolitics, with the U.S. pretty much completely checked out of the region, if not the world at large, and the Russians reasserting their commitment to this. And again, I think Syria is, as always, one of those places to keep your eye on. And I think this is going to be a very active summer in Syria. I think it's going to be a very good summer for the pro government forces, cleaning up everything west of the Euphrates, maybe even touching that vaunted pocket along the Iraqi and Jordanian border. I wouldn't go that far, but let's not discount any possibilities here. But I'm going to make a bold prediction, and some of you are probably going to scoff at me, some of you are probably going to laugh at me. I think this is the last summer of Idlib.
Wow. Uh, I hope you're right. I really do. Um, to that, I would say it was interesting. I saw a Reuters special on a man who loves horses, an equestrian who found safety in Idlib. They're
Well,
already
in terms of other absurd stories, I saw two gangbangers from LA, both of Armenian backgrounds, joining pro Assad militias in Syria.
wow.
The two
Hello, base.
genders.
So I don't know if that's a prep for legitimizing Idlib because Idlib was mentioned as a liberated zone of Syria. It was ridiculous. What Idlib also has is a growing ISIS presence.
Idlib is the Chaz of Syria.
Yeah, the chance of Syria. Um, and there have been successful attacks, including a tank that was knocked out, a Syrian tank, by Turkish-backed forces. Uh, it may be that relations will spoil so badly with the Americans. I mean, the Russians have already stepped up their bombing campaign in the last year, anyways, and particularly in 2021. So, and I don't think relations between America and Russia are going to get any better. So, Russia could just easily just say, well, we're not having it. We're getting rid of these guys, and you can cry all you want about uh, I don't know, refugees or civilians dying and so on and so on. You're you're propping these people up. You're giving them hope they shouldn't have. And the truth is, if America was going through a civil war and there were chunks that were torn off, you think America would tolerate, like, let's say, I don't know, an area of the Rockies that had seceded, and they had other international players supporting them. Like,
You
you'd
don't
have
even
to
have to
be
get hypothetical. Look at our own Civil War, and that was 160 years ago.
right. Good point. So no, it's not liberated. These people don't have a right to it uh, because they don't have any legitimacy. And at the end of the day, especially in a civil war situation, it's force, it's power that has legitimacy.
Yeah, and especially as they've lost favor with foreign backers. That's again now. I think one other big contingent thing that comes to it being the last summer of Idlib playing in my prediction is that Russia came out on top of this Ukraine dispute. They made the Western world look foolish. They asserted their own power in their backyard, and I think that sets a good trend. Maybe the West will feel spurned, but at this point, I think the West is beyond feeling spurned and is probably looking to just disengage and walk away from the situation. They're not interested in a new fight. They're not interested in new skirmish, a new conflict, any sort of uphill battle, and that they'll just take the L on this one. They'll just go ahead and say, look, it's been 10 years. Just forget it already. Now, of course, that's not what the rhetoric will be, but that's what the actions will be. And I know this is a bold prediction, but I'm just saying that Idlib is going to fall by the end of the summer, beginning of fall, with just diplomatic protests from Washington, London, Paris, etc.
Well, I mean, I hope it happens. It still remains to be seen what America is going to do in that northeastern section of Syria where it's literally hoarding and selling the oil illegally and is illegally occupying that huge chunk in east central Syria along the Iraqi border. Um, I mean, well, I don't know. I mean, will they leave? Is leaving Afghanistan about upping the ante in Syria? I don't know. It's hard to say. I know that I don't want to diverge too much off topic, but we can expect that once America is actually gone from Afghanistan, of course, we know that the Taliban will eventually regain the country, or at least most of the country. It'll be ostensibly run, and for the most part, by the Taliban. But you're going to have, a, again, a huge wave of refugees and migrants that will piggyback on this, along with the legitimate refugees that will come out of it. And according to what Hillary Clinton suggested, Biden needs to set up an express visa program to get these people out of there. Not unlike Vietnam.
Oh yes, at the fall of Saigon and the waves of refugees coming out of there. Except I have a feeling that not that the Vietnamese were too highly educated or skilled people when they first came over here. I have a feeling it's not going to translate nearly the same with a country as undeveloped as Afghanistan. But again, we'll see how this all plays out. Maybe they can take refuge somewhere in Europe. Maybe they can take refuge as new fighters in Syria. Who knows? Maybe that's their new prospects. The pro American forces in Afghanistan will flee to go fight for the pro American forces in Syria. Who really, it's not off the table at this point. It wouldn't be that absurd. I don't think anyone who listens to the show, especially you or I, would be surprised if some sort of absurd headline like that came out. I'd say, like, I'm gonna want to see more on this, but like I don't have a hard time believing this sort of thing. But with that being said, maybe they'll go to Yemen, because the other big news is, of course, out of Yemen, and you have the half-hearted peace calls with Saudi Arabia saying, "Oh well, we admire the Yemeni efforts, and we think we think we can get along with them. They're true Yemenis and they're true Arabians with their fighting spirit." Of course, the Crown Prince was saying, and of course, Saudi Arabia is has been in dire straits for the past 6 7 years, ever since the initial 2014 oil boom in the United States and the production of Russian oil upping, and again after especially gas prices went into the negative. Now they're predicting a gas shortage. We'll see how that plays out because of the damage to the American energy industry and the uh, lifting of restrictions, more people traveling across the country, more people driving, etc. But it looks like, again, they keep pushing further and further south to Abiyan, and that I think the Saudis are desperate for some sort of settlement, some sort of peace deal, because if this war goes on longer, they're going to get more egg on their face than they already had, because not only was Saudi Arabia committing atrocities in Yemen, now, again, war is brutal, war is hell. A lot of bad things happen to people that don't deserve it in war, non combatants included. But it's even worse, and I think Vietnam was also a lesson to this, to wage a brutal war when you also do it incompetently and don't even come close to accomplishing your goals. Because there's one thing about using swift, brutal, and effective force and moving quickly into it. Syria, with the pro-Assad and the Russian side, is arguably that. Now, of course, I think they play up the casualties, they play up the civilian losses and that. But, like, again, they hit Idlib hard, they hit Idlib fast, and they advance. But when you hit Yemen hard and when you hit Yemen fast when you're Saudi Arabia, and you still get egg on your face when you still have these bottle rockets landing in Riyadh and at these oil facilities, you not only look like an aggressive bully, you also look grossly incompetent, which is probably the worst combination you can look like on the world stage. Because if you're an aggressive bully that can get what you want, people are going to respect and or fear you, and you're going to get what you want. But if you're an aggressive bully that isn't even able to exert your will, you just look like a clown. You look like a fool. People simultaneously hate you and laugh at you. And I think that's where Saudi Arabia has gotten now. I think that's why they're so damn desperate for a peace deal with the Yemenis at this point, or at least the Houthis at this point, because they realize they've lost this war. And I think they lost this war all the way back in 2017 when it broke out in 2015 in any significant numbers, and they're just now admitting to it. Like, again, how long have these bottle rockets been flying at the Saudis? I mean, they started hitting targets in southern Saudi Arabia, I would say, sometime in 2016, 2017. They were hitting Riyadh and strategic oil fields in 2018, 2019. 2020, the war calmed down, at least the coverage on the war calmed down. And all of a sudden, we're back to 2020, and they're almost to the coastline. They've almost reclaimed the borders. The Houthis have almost reclaimed the borders of the former country of North Yemen. And at this point, again, should the Houthis take it? I don't know. I'm not in their position. Frankly, I think they need to push a little further. I think they can milk every cent they can out of Saudi Arabia. Biden has shown very little willingness to get involved in this conflict and sort of just patting Saudi Arabia on the back, giving them cash and old arms. But I think the Houthis, especially with Iranian sponsorship and who knows what other foreign sponsorship they can court, should push this, and they should milk every penny and every concession they can out of the Saudis. I think they should push through to Abiyan. And from a strategic standpoint, I think it'd be like I think what they'll probably try to do is push to Abiyan and like try to get that coastline and clean up this at this southwestern corner of Yemen, and then they can try to contract, can get concessions from the Saudis. Now, I don't know if that's going to happen, but again, I don't think the Saudis have the wherewithal in terms of economic power, military power, and just will to continue to wage this war that they've lost against these people who are impoverished, starved peasants at this point, using these makeshift rockets, some of which they get from Iran.
Right, and many that they're developing on their own. I mean, it's a regular weekly occurrence now for months, if not almost a year, that Yemenis who have no navy and no air force are able to hit targets in Riyadh, whether it's an airport, whether it's a an oil refinery. I mean, they're hitting choice targets. It's not like people can say that, well, in many cases the damage isn't that severe or it's repaired. Yeah, but it's a bad look. This erodes confidence in the government from its own people. So it does play a role. And like you say, the closest we've seen to capitulation was last week, you know, by the Crown Prince. It's it's not a good look.
And like I said, it continues further on to the point where, yeah, he's pretty much outright saying, "Oh, please accept this settlement. Please accept these negotiations." But at this point, again, I think against all odds, the Houthis have done this. Now, I thought just from following this war from like 2018 onwards, they would hold their ground. They would be a thorn in Saudi Arabia's side, but never would I have expected them to be this successful. And
Hmm.
frankly, I think it just shows how weak-willed these Gulf states are. I think it shows really the fragility of these countries that were carved pretty much out of nothing. Now, of course, all borders are artificial, all borders are arbitrary, but especially in these cases with the House of Saud and the different dynasties they established there, I think at the end of the day, we're seeing these artificial countries fall through to a tribal group that has really made this land their own for the past however many years. Now, of course, it's not like these people were imported to the Arabian Peninsula, but again, their identities, the identity of a Saudi is artificial. Half of their country's name just comes from the royal family that rules them, the House of Saud, and the fact that they're Arabians. It's at the end of the day, I think that it just comes down to a battle of willpower. Sure, the Houthis were outgunned and outmanned by ridiculous margins. Of course, there was plenty of support from Iranian and pro-Iranian groups that got them rockets in the country, that got them this sort of material and military aid. But then the day, compared to the aid that Saudi Arabia was getting from places like the United States and the United Kingdom, I think it's comes down to a battle of willpower. I mean, they already the Yemeni forces, the Houthi forces, have pretty much gotten the UAE to call it quits on it, and I'd say it's only a matter of time before they get the Saudis to call it quits. And it looks like Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince, is getting pretty close to that point. Now, I know that the current king of Saudi Arabia still technically wields political power in the country, but at this point, it seems to be the crown prince that's really calling the shots here. And with the age of the current king, it's only a matter of time before Mohammed bin Salman takes the throne himself. So it could be that instant where he finally assumes control of the country and decides to call it quits. It's going to be a massive blemish from both a humanitarian, quote unquote, has as much as that word means, quote unquote, humanitarian standpoint, and just a purely strategic and military standpoint. This is going to be a major blemish on Saudi Arabia for decades to come.
Yeah, it's an embarrassment. It's a defeat. I mean, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, United Arab Emirates, all of them were so confident up until early 2015 that they were going to topple Assad as well. And that is another failure because we know from WikiLeaks that Saudi Arabia was funding Al Qaeda and some other groups. Definitely Qatar was.
Yeah, Qatar, the UAE, etc. And yeah, like I said, against all odds, it looks like they pulled it off. The Houthis pulled it off, and really, love them or hate them, you have to admit this is impressive and just showing what sheer will and sheer desire to fight on and press on can do. And
Hmm. And it's such a strong geopolitical position, right at the mouth of the Red Sea, going into the Indian Ocean.
yeah,
Uh,
a
it,
great spot to
it,
sabotage oil tankers, one might think.
Right. So choice spot, and you also have to hand it to Iran for being able to capitalize on this. This is a brilliant move, uh, brilliant diplomatic move as well, because uh, it certainly adds pressure to other state actors like Saudi Arabia and America, but primarily Saudi Arabia and some of the other Gulf states.
Yeah, I'm curious that Israel hasn't set the long-range missile or two into Houthi territory as sort of like a test or a show of force, but I think they got enough problems with Gaza on one side and Syria on the other. And yeah, again, it seems like all these countries that are strong, stalwart allies of the United States, quote unquote, and that get just these massive amount of aid are just rooted time and time again by these pissant forces with bile rockets. It's wild. And again, I think it goes down to sheer willpower. Now, Hamas, they might support every other American foreign policy goal, whether that be uprising Muslim Brotherhood takeover of Egypt or Muslim Brotherhood takeover of Syria, etc. But it's Israel that they oppose, which is the one fact they can't compromise on, and so perhaps Hezbollah is the better example there because they're more decidedly against the American presence in the region, pretty much unequivocally, whether that be Syria, whether that be Iraq or wherever. But that's all I have to say for that part. Just sheer willpower, and that's really all I have to say for the show. We're pushing an hour 40, so I think it's time to wrap it up.
Okay.
Um, but I hope you guys enjoyed this slightly longer edition of the War Report. It's good to be back in the swing of things. We still haven't quite gotten back to our Saturday show schedule yet, which I suppose will happen eventually. But we figured we'd get an episode out to you guys because there was a lot of news items we had to cover, and better not to let those things pile up and give you guys like a 2 hour 10-minute show. I think
Yeah.
I'd lose what little audience I had if I subject you to that much content, and I think I'm probably losing viewers by the second as I continue to drag this show on, which is why I will say thank you everyone for tuning into this episode of the War Report. We will see you guys next time, and goodbye.
Take care.